Snow fell over the border forest without mercy, covering the ground in a thick white blanket that swallowed every sound. Illyra ran through the trees with her bare feet bleeding, her breath coming out in short white clouds. Behind her, she could still hear the growls of the rogue wolves that had chased her out of her old pack's territory. She did not look back. She could not afford to. 3 days ago, she had been an Omega of the Silver Hollow Pack, the lowest rank among her kind. She had never been able to fully shift into her wolf form, and the others mocked her for it, calling her broken, weak, and useless. When the pack elders decided she brought shame to their bloodline, they cast her out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. Since then, she had been running, hiding, and starving, trying to survive in lands that did not belong to her. Her legs finally gave out near a frozen stream. She fell into the snow, her vision blurring at the edges. She thought of her mother, long dead, and wondered if she would see her again soon. The cold no longer felt sharp. It felt like sleep. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the heavy sound of paws crashing through snow, and a deep, commanding growl that shook the very air around her. Ronan Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Crimson Moon Kingdom, had been patrolling the northern border alone, as he often did when the weight of ruling became too heavy to bear inside his palace walls. He was a broad, powerful man, with dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky, feared across every territory for his strength and his coldness. He rarely showed mercy, and he trusted almost no one. He caught her scent from nearly a mile away, faint and strange, unlike any Omega he had encountered before. It should not have mattered to him. A stranger dying in the snow at his border was not his concern. Kings did not stop for strays. Yet something in that scent pulled at him, something he could not explain, and before he understood why, he was already running toward it. He found her curled beneath a fallen tree, her lips turning blue, her body trembling weakly. She was thin, too thin, and her clothes were torn and stained with old blood. For a long moment, Ronan simply stood over her, frowning, telling himself this was foolish. Then, without another thought, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back to his palace through the storm. His advisors were furious when he arrived, an unclaimed Omega, brought into the palace of the Alpha King, with no pack, no name they recognized, and no explanation. It was unheard of. His beta, Callan, argued that it was beneath their king's dignity to trouble himself with a stray. "She may be diseased, she may be a spy sent by our enemies," Callan said, pacing before the throne. "She was dying," Ronan said simply, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Have the healers tend to her. That is the end of the discussion." He told himself it was only honor. A king who let the weak die at his doorstep was no king worth following. That was the only reason. It had nothing to do with the way her scent had wrapped around him like a memory he had never lived, or the strange ache that settled in his chest when he thought of leaving her behind. Illyra woke 3 days later in a bed softer than anything she had ever known, wrapped in warm blankets, her wounds cleaned and bandaged. For a moment, she believed she had died and this was some strange afterlife. Then a healer entered, an older woman with kind eyes, and explained where she was and who had saved her. "The Alpha King," Illyra whispered, disbelief thick in her voice. "Why would he save someone like me?" The healer only smiled, and said the king rarely explained his reasons to anyone, least of all to himself. In the days that followed, Illyra remained in the palace under careful watch. She expected to be thrown out the moment she was strong enough to walk, or worse, punished for daring to exist within royal walls. Instead, Ronan gave quiet orders that she be given a room, proper meals, and time to heal fully. He visited her rarely, and when he did, he spoke little, watching her with an unreadable expression before leaving again without explanation. Illyra noticed strange things beginning to happen around her, though she did not understand them at first. The guards stationed outside her door, hardened warriors who answered to no one but the king, would soften their stance whenever she passed, lowering their eyes respectfully, as if she were someone of importance. When she once asked a servant, hesitantly, if she might have a second blanket for the cold nights, the woman did not simply agree. She hurried away, as though the request had been a command from the king himself, returning moments later with 3 blankets instead of 1. Elira assumed these were simple acts of kindness, perhaps born from pity, or fear of angering their king should they treat his guest poorly. She had been taught her entire life that she held no power at all. Why would anyone believe differently now? Ronan noticed far more than he let on. He watched his own trained wolves, fierce animals bred for battle and obedience only to him, dip their heads low whenever Elira walked near the training grounds. He watched his most stubborn guards yield to her softest requests without hesitation, something they would never do for any ordinary Omega, and certainly not for a stranger with no pack and no title. He said nothing of it at first. He was not a man who spoke of things he did not understand, and there was a quiet part of him that feared what it might mean if he asked the question aloud. Instead, he found himself drawn to her more with each passing week, seeking reasons to walk past her window, to sit near her at meals, to ask the healers of her progress, far more often than a king should ask about a stray he had merely taken pity on. Elira, for her part, found herself waiting for his visits, treasuring the rare moments he spoke to her, as though she were more than a burden he had chosen to carry. He was not cruel to her, not once, though his voice was often clipped and his manner distant. She began to see beneath the cold exterior he wore like armor, glimpses of a man who carried the weight of an entire kingdom alone, who trusted almost no one, and who seemed, in his quiet way, to be studying her just as closely as she studied him. One evening, as autumn began to turn toward winter again, Ronan found her sitting alone in the palace garden, watching the last golden leaves fall from the trees. He sat beside her without invitation, something he had never done before. "You do not act like an Omega who was cast out and left for dead," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on her. Elira's hands tightened in her lap. "What do you mean?" "You do not cower. You do not grovel. Even the healers, who could crush you with a single command, seem to answer to you instead." He turned to look at her then, his gaze sharp and searching. "Do you understand why that might be?" Elira shook her head slowly. "I have always been told I was weak. That I had no gift worth speaking of. I believed them, my whole life." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his stormy eyes. "Perhaps they were wrong," he said quietly, and then he rose and walked away before she could ask him what he meant. Elira did not have long to wonder. Word soon reached the palace that a rival Alpha, Draven of the Ashen Fang territory, had learned of the strange Omega hidden within the Crimson Moon Kingdom, the one rumored to make even trained wolves bow without a single word spoken. Draven, hungry for power and always searching for any advantage over his rivals, decided he would take her for himself, believing she might be some rare and valuable weapon he could use to strengthen his own pack. His warriors struck at dawn, breaching the outer wall before the palace guards could fully rally. Chaos spread through the courtyard as wolves clashed in the pale morning light, snarls and cries echoing off the stone walls. Ronan fought at the front of his soldiers, cutting down enemy after enemy, but Draven's forces were many, and they pressed hard toward the palace, straight toward the chambers where Elira had been hidden away. Elira heard the fighting and, rather than remaining hidden as she had been told, ran toward the sound, terrified for the man who had saved her life without ever asking anything in return. She arrived just as Ronan, wounded and bleeding from a deep gash along his side, stumbled to protect her from 3 of Draven's largest warriors, who had broken through the line meant to guard her. "Run," Ronan commanded, forcing himself upright despite his injury, placing his body between her and the approaching wolves. Elira could not run. Fear for him rooted her in place, and something inside her, something that had been sleeping her entire life, finally woke. Without thinking, without understanding what she was doing, she stepped forward and spoke, her voice carrying a strange, resonant power that did not belong to any ordinary Omega. "Stop," she said, and the word rang out like thunder across the courtyard. Every wolf within earshot froze. Draven's warriors, mid-charge, dropped to their knees as though an invisible weight had crushed them downward. Even Ronan's own soldiers paused, staring in stunned silence. Draven himself, who had come expecting easy prey, felt his legs buckle beneath him despite every effort to resist, his snarl turning to a whimper of confusion and fear. Elira stood trembling in the center of the courtyard, her hands shaking at what had just happened, at the power that had poured out of her without warning. She was no ordinary Omega. She was something far rarer, something the old stories spoke of only in legend, a Luna Prime, born once in many generations, gifted with the ability to command any wolf regardless of pack or bloodline, an authority that superseded even that of an Alpha King. Draven, humiliated and defeated, called a hasty retreat, dragging his stunned warriors away from the palace before Illyra's strange power could be turned against them fully. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun, with far less bloodshed than anyone had feared. Ronan stared at Illyra across the courtyard, his wound forgotten for the moment, disbelief and something far softer written plainly across his face. The Omega he had pulled from the snow out of pity, the woman his court had dismissed as worthless and broken, had just brought his enemies to their knees with a single word. "You are Luna Prime," he said quietly, walking toward her slowly, as though approaching something precious and easily frightened away. "All this time, and you never knew." "I did not know," Illyra whispered, tears finally falling freely down her face, tears of exhaustion, fear, and disbelief all at once. "I was always told I was nothing." Ronan reached her then, gently taking her trembling hands in his own. "You were never nothing," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had never allowed himself to show before. "I saw it from the first night I found you. I did not understand it then. I understand it now." That night, before his entire court, Ronan did something no Alpha King had ever done before. He knelt. He knelt before Illyra, the Omega the world had discarded, the woman his own pack once believed unworthy of even a passing glance. Gasps rippled through the gathered nobles and warriors, disbelief plain on every face, yet Ronan did not waver. "I do not kneel because tradition demands it," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I kneel because I choose her. Because from the moment I carried her through the snow, some part of me already knew what the rest of me is only now brave enough to say aloud. She is not beneath this kingdom. She is its equal, and I would have her stand beside me, not behind me, for as long as she will allow it." Illyra, overwhelmed, could hardly find her voice, but she did not need many words. She simply reached down and helped him rise, and when their eyes met, everything that needed to be understood passed silently between them. The Crimson Moon Kingdom soon learned to whisper her name with respect rather than mockery. The girl once cast out as broken became known throughout every territory as the Luna, who could command wolves with a single word, standing beside her king, not out of duty, but out of a bond neither of them had expected, yet neither would ever trade away. And in the quiet moments between them, when the crown and the courts faded into the background, Ronan often reminded her softly that he had not saved her that night in the snow. She had saved herself, long before he ever arrived. He had simply been fortunate enough to be there when she finally realized it.